We certainly welcome all of you here this afternoon to give your close attention to our speaker, Brother John Adams. He's an elder with the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the Brooklyn headquarters. Brother Adams also has the privilege of serving as zone overseer. Let's give him now our close attention as he speaks to us on the subject, Why Jehovah Empties the Earth. Brother Adams.
We've often heard in the scriptures that Jehovah made the earth as a home for mankind, and we have to admit that it's a very beautiful home. But of course, some people care for the home that Jehovah has assigned them a lot more than others do. We can appreciate this illustration because I know that no self-respecting housewife likes to see a dirty home. Well, no self-respecting mayor of a city likes to see a city going to rack and ruin with slums and garbage on the streets and tin cans all over and so on. Well, we can certainly imagine then how Jehovah God feels. Here he's made a beautiful creation, something that he looked upon and it was very good. In fact, it was a perfect home for mankind. Now we go about us today and we see some of the slums of the earth and how man has abused this home, and we can just imagine how Jehovah himself feels. Supposing you walked into that second home and you no sooner get in the front door and you smell this terrible rank smell from the basement, and you say, my word, what are these people keeping around here? Well, you know, the way Jehovah looks on the earth, he might say the same thing, because the earth is being rapidly ruined by the pollution of many kinds, including air pollution. A few months ago, a newspaper out in Arizona said the last city in the United States with really clean air has now disappeared. There are no more. And maybe you remember the Life magazine report a little while ago. It had the headline, "The Day the Air Became Unbreathable." Well, now, we can all breathe all right, but this happened up in New Jersey, a little town not too far from New York City. It was the fall of the year. The young men were out at the high school practicing football. People were going about the business. There was a pall over the city, a gray pall. Well, you often see that in New York in that area. But as these boys were going to the practice, here they were, young people in the prime of life, where pretty soon one would start taking sick and he'd lie over and start gasping and then get sick to his stomach. And then the other started collapsing, and pretty soon the practice started slowing down and the boys began running erratically. They finally took them in and took them to the hospital, and they thought, well, maybe someone's been spraying some insecticide in the area and it affected their nervous system. Well, it happened. The hospital they took them to was very advanced technologically, and so they checked the bloodstream of the boys. No trace of pesticide. They decided they better check the air quality. The air quality was distinctly unsatisfactory. Now, it happened that anyone that stayed in that day didn't get all this smog and pollution, but these boys who were out there gulping down big lungfuls of air were severely affected by it, so that they couldn't even finish their practice, and several wound up in the hospital overnight, and several elderly people with respiratory problems also had to be hospitalized, and as I recall, some even died on that occasion. Well, now, is this going to be a growing thing? It seems that it is, the way things are going at present. A New York paper recently talked about the growing cloud mass of air pollution over the eastern seaboard, and it said from Boston right on down to Norfolk. Well, you can see this cloud mass of real fine material in the air that just hangs there. It's so fine that the winds and the rain don't wash it away. Well, anyone who's flown into one of the big cities knows what that's about. You are up there in the plane, and the sun is shining, and the sky is blue, and the clouds are nice and bright and white, and then you see below you this dirty, gray pall. Well, now that's what the people down below are breathing. That's what hangs over the city, because man hasn't really been taking care of this paradise home that God gave him. But it's not only New York, down in Mexico City. They say that the city is usually wrapped in a gray-yellow cloud of dust and gases and filth. They conducted some studies down there, and they said that the carbon monoxide concentration in downtown streets is higher than New York City, and the sulfur monoxide concentration is higher than London. Well, I talked to some old-timers at the Mexico City branch down there, and they pointed out a big, tall government building about a mile or so away. They said it used to be you could see that sharply and distinctly. He says now some days we can hardly make out the outline. Visibility, they say, has been reduced to 1/5 in 30 years. And pretty soon you go around, you need a flashlight to see where you're going. One newspaper said that it has been estimated that at the present rate of pollution by 1990, all children in Mexico City will suffer from rickets, and adults will have to wear gas masks day and night. And only on Sunday, when the big industries are closed, will the sky seem blue. In fact, the Department of Labor and Social Welfare has a right to close factories if they exceed 50 parts of carbon monoxide emission per million. But downtown streets exceed that by 4 times. Well, now, some doctors have said that when it reaches 200 million, humans will lose consciousness and suffer irreversible brain damage. Now, this really has an effect. You know, one young brother came up and said, well, I've been to Mexico City. I didn't find any real problem. No, not on a visit, but if you live there, pretty soon your lungs get coated, your health begins to deteriorate, and so on. I know a brother in New York City. He said he always wondered what the problem was, but he goes into the city and he drives around. He's a salesman. He's out on the streets driving all day. He says by the time he gets home at night, he's so loggy and just generally down that it takes him a half hour out in the suburbs where he can get a little fresh air before he begins to come around and feel like a human being again. Well, man is really poisoning his environment. There's no doubt about it. In fact, over in Japan, at some Tokyo intersections, traffic police have stations where they have oxygen masks so the officer can go to breathe some fresh air. Otherwise, they just couldn't keep going. In fact, they have slot machines on some places over there where pedestrians can go to buy a whiff of oxygen for so much to give them a little pickup to keep them going. And I understand they also have sound trucks that will go through the streets announcing to the people, now, the air quality is so bad today, you better stay home if you can. In fact, in downtown Tokyo, they say that the beautiful trees around the Imperial Palace that are in the downtown area are having problems. The leaves keep on turning yellow and withering and falling off because the air quality is so bad. Well, now we see a similar situation in other parts of the Earth's environment, in the oceans. This oceanographer Jacques Cousteau said that pollution and overfishing have killed 40% of the marine life in the oceans. And a Life magazine report said that the common haddock is an endangered species. Less than 10% of Atlantic herring remain. The last U.S. whaling vessels are out of business. The yellowfin flounder fisheries have been wiped out, and the present catch rate dooms the tuna. Well, now, I understand the brothers around here have caught some fish, and they caught a very fine batch in a short time. So some are going to say, well, there's still fish out there. But one of the brothers that did the catching said, 5-10 years ago, you could catch 60, 70 pounders. He said these were all 10, 12, 15 pounders. So the big ones are going, and the catch is getting lighter and lighter, as many people have testified. Well, what about the bird and animal life? It's rather interesting. Here we have the wildlife. Now, if they're affected, then you know that mankind is also affected health-wise by what's going on in his earthly home. Well, one report says 500 pair of brown pelicans on one island produced only one young last year. Why was that? The high pesticide levels had upset their reproductive systems. Well, now, man doesn't seem to be affected, but there may be more effect than we realize. Over in Denmark, they say that storks that used to arrive numbering 10,000 100 years ago each spring from Africa now saw only 70 come in. Well, bird life is really being depleted. Over 30 years ago, there were 30 to 40,000 magnificent tigers in the Indian jungle. Now they say perhaps there are 2,000 left. A report from Mexico says that frequently young lambs and cows and bulls are found dead in zones sprayed with insecticides. And then what happens? The crows and the eagles and the other birds come in and eat these carcasses, and pretty soon the birds are dead. Well, just as these conditions affect animal and fish and bird life, they're bound to take their toll on humankind also. In fact, more and more people are getting concerned about it. It's not only Jehovah who looks down and sees that man is ruining the earth, but mankind are often worrying what the end of this is going to be. Sometimes they joke about it. A South American paper had a little cartoon. The mother was going to give the baby a bath, and the little child said, "But Mama, how do we know the water isn't contaminated?" Well, how do we know indeed? Especially now that they're talking about a chlorine shortage. There may be more and more water contamination. Well, recently some of the Gilead students went up to the UN to visit there and to see the institution, hear what they were trying to do for mankind, and they had a folder talking about the human environment. It's quite interesting to look at this. They say wildlife, endangered species now total 922. Water, fresh water, comprises less than 1% of Earth's supply, and man is using so much of this precious commodity, many nations are headed for serious trouble. Land. The good earth is not equal to the enormous demands being made on it. Even if food output is doubled in the next 30 years, half of the people will still be hungry. By then, there may be twice as many mouths to feed. Minerals. Richly endowed with minerals as our earth is, there is no room for complacency. Air. Nature pollutes the air but also cleanses it, but mankind causes air pollution, and so on. It goes right on through this. It gives a forecast of coming events, you might say. It has here water, situation poor, outlook uncertain. We're dipping into underground reserves. Pollution is increasing. Then you turn the page and it talks about the wildlife that we've mentioned. Next comes land. It says situation bad, outlook grim. It says amount of food producing land per capita is shrinking. Then it talks about the minerals. Situation fair for now, outlook not good. And they go on to talk about the oil supplies, and they say that they forecast a serious and critical shortage of fuel supplies by 1985. Well, that was back in the spring of the year. Back in the spring of last year, that sounded pretty good. They said, well, my fuel shortage by 1965, it came a little sooner than they anticipated, didn't it? Then we talk about the air here, and it says air pollution knows no boundaries. Poisons in the air over Europe will later be poison in the air over Asia and North America. Situation bad in big cities. Outlook may get worse. Then they talk about the population. Now, here's some really amazing things. It says the fact, well, first of all, the myth is that wars, disease, and natural disasters will control population surplus. So many people say, well, there's too many people, the wars kill them off. Here's the fact. In 5 years of terrible war, the population of North and South Vietnam has grown more than 3 million. Here's another fact. A giant tidal wave killed more than 500,000 in East Pakistan in 1970. This number was replaced in 35 days. So the situation is really getting difficult all over the world. But one thing we haven't even mentioned, and that's attitudes of the people. Because, you know, it's one thing if you're a householder and you go into the house and you point out, well, now you're not taking good care of the property, and the person in the house says, yes, we've been busy about other things, but we'll get right to it. They want to do something. But now, what is the general outlook or attitude of people in the world toward the great creator of our earth? Many don't even recognize that God exists. And really, it seems that the thinking of mankind, not just the environment, but the thinking of mankind is getting more and more contaminated. A mayor over in Guilo, Rhodesia, commented on that. He said that pollution of the mind to him was far more serious than pollution of the environment. Well, how is thinking changing? We go to church, and even some clergymen will say they believe in evolution, or they talk about God being dead and things like that. So people say, why listen to God? And what's the result? There's a dropping of moral standards. Years ago, why, even in New York City, they didn't have to lock the doors when they leave. Now, my word, you find 3 and 4 locks on the door and a great big police bar behind it, and then they come in through the window. Well, it's not only that, the thievery, but as the Awake magazine recently reported, there's a startling and sharp increase in crimes of violence. And more of the young ones are getting involved in these kind of things. Well, now if you were the homeowner and there's a group of wild, undisciplined children in the home, you know what's going to happen. And that's really the way the world is getting, without care or love for God or neighbor. In fact, one of the missionaries made an interesting comment. Now, this happened to be from India, but you could get similar reports from just about any country in the world. And this witness over in India said Calcutta now is in a really awful state, with murders, bomb blasts, and arson occurring every day. On every important street intersection, there's a traffic policeman in the center, but at each corner there are armed, steel-helmeted policemen. The city and surroundings are menaced by a terrorist group known as the Naxalites, influenced by Peking's Mao. The missionaries have so far escaped any violent destruction, though one day Sister Zavitz was in a bus when a bomb was thrown without hitting anyone on the bus, and no one was hurt. But it is unsafe to be out after dark. And similar conditions are increasing all over the world. So really we have to ask, well now, is there any real security or hope for the future? Many people ask, well, how long is Jehovah going to continue to let the earth be ruined? He's promised to bring to ruin those ruining the earth. So when we see these conditions, we say, well, this surely must be the time then, because as the Awake magazine recently reported, the population and the demands for natural resources are straining the upper reaches of the earth's capabilities. So now we're approaching the time when Jehovah is going to do something. We rightly ask the question, how long will man's lovely garden home be brought to ruin? And how can the tremendous population problem of this earth be overcome and controlled when the population in many countries seems to keep rising without control? Well, now, Jehovah has foretold what he is going to do, and it's appropriate we consider a little bit what the Bible book of Isaiah has to say about this, because Isaiah's name means salvation of Jehovah. And salvation can only come from Jehovah. It was written over 700 years before the time of Christ, and the words are certainly prophetic. We read at Isaiah 30, verse 8, where it says, "Come now, write it in a tablet with them, and inscribe it even in a book, that it may serve for a future day, for a witness to time indefinite." So Jehovah has given his witness now, his recorded testimony of what he's going to do. It's interesting, too, that the Apostle Paul testified to Isaiah's authenticity, saying at Romans 15:12, and again Isaiah says, "There will be the root of Jesse, and there will be one arising to rule nations. On him the nations will rest their hope." So through this line of Jesse that David was from and Christ Jesus was from, why we have the hope. Now, what about Isaiah's prophecy? Is it accurate? Well, it was interesting that back in 1947, some ancient documents were found in a cave in Jordan. They call them the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these documents included the account in Isaiah. But these were about 2,000 years old, going back to the 1st or 2nd century before the time of Christ. So they were 1,000 years older than any other extant manuscript of Isaiah. And yet we find they're identical, except for some minor variations in spelling. So they give convincing proof that the prophecy is given by Jehovah to Isaiah, as recorded by Isaiah, is accurately found in our copies of the Scriptures today. Now, it's interesting that apart from Moses, no other Bible writer has been quoted so often. And Isaiah is very appropriately called the evangelist prophet, because there are so many predictions that he wrote that were fulfilled in the life of Christ Jesus. In fact, you know, when you read that 53rd chapter of Isaiah, why, it's just like an eyewitness account of what was going to happen in Jesus' life, his death, how he'd be led to the slaughter like a sheep. It's a very stirring account and was accurately fulfilled hundreds of years later in Jesus' life and ministry. But now this afternoon, we're especially interested in what Isaiah says in chapters 24 and 26, because here it tells of Jehovah's judgment and his salvation. And Jehovah says that he is going to empty the land to clean it of pollution. And that's going to be no big problem for Jehovah any more than it's a big problem for a housewife to clean off the dishes and get them sparkling and shiny and ready for appropriate use. But he goes on to explain that it's going to affect everyone. He says the people, the priest, the servant, the master, the buyer, the seller, all must go because of bypassing God's laws and breaking his indefinitely lasting covenant. And then he assures that those who have been held prisoners, you might say, in bondage under Satan's old system, are going to be freed. And he says he'll set a banquet in his mountain for all these people, swallowing up even death forever. So Isaiah says, this is our God, this is Jehovah. We find that continuous peace and blessings for the earth are going to come to those trusting in Jehovah, but he says the wicked simply will not learn righteousness. Well, what does it all mean? It really means that God is going to clean out these inhabitants of the second house that care so little for the rightful owner of the earth and take so little care of the fine property that he's entrusted to their care. And we find this really prophetically recorded in the Bible account in God's dealings with Judah and with Israel. Now, this is true because what happened to those territories, the tribes back there in Israel, were prophetic of what's coming on this system of things, and particularly on Christendom. As we read at 1 Corinthians 10:11, it says, now these things went on befalling them as examples, and were written for a warning to us, upon whom the ends of the systems of things have arrived. Well, many people, even in the world with no knowledge of God's Word, common people, scientists say, we're coming to the end of something. Well, the Bible shows us it's going to be the end of this system of things. It has to be, because time is running out the way mankind is living here on the earth. But now, what is the connection between ancient Judah and Israel and Christendom today? Is there anything in their history that would show what God is about to do to the earth today? Well, yes, there is. And first of all, we notice there's some very striking parallels here. For example, Christendom, that is the nations that profess to be Christian, say that they're in a relationship with God. People go to church, they come back feeling good, and they say, well, now I've been serving God, you say. Although many of them forget even what God's name is recorded there in Psalm 83:18, Jehovah. But the fact is that Christendom claims to be serving this God, Jehovah, and so do the people of Judah and Jerusalem. The people back there said they were under the law covenant. Well, now today they say, according to the Christian Greek scriptures, we're under the new covenant. That's what Christendom claims. Christendom accepts generally the Hebrew part of the Bible, just as the people of Judah did. They say they're looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. That's what the Jews were looking forward to. They say they're traveling through the world to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. So you see, they're tied right in with the Scriptures. Say they're serving and worshiping the God of the Bible. So the correspondences are striking, because that was the position as professed servers of Jehovah that Judah and Israel were in. But now let's see if Judah had any warning before Jehovah took action for their wrongdoing. The nation of Israel had taken over the promised land, as you recall, after being delivered from Egypt. They drove out the Canaanites. Well, now this was prophetic, because the earth that our picture today is the promised land, what God is going to give to the people loving and serving and worshiping Him. And why did He dispossess some of these people? Why were the Canaanites dispossessed, as we hope to see these people who are befouling the earth and ruining the earth today dispossessed? Well, Deuteronomy, the 9th chapter, verses 5 and 6, mentioned to the Israelites that it wasn't that these people were, or that the ones coming in were so perfect, because after all, they weren't perfect, neither are we perfect. But he says it is for the wickedness of those nations that Jehovah is driving them away from before you. It is not for your righteousness or the righteousness of your heart that you are going in to take possession of the land. In fact, it is for the wickedness of these nations that Jehovah your God is driving them away from before you to carry out the word that Jehovah swore to your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, now, that was true back then. When we look around the earth today and see what's done in the name of God, and how people have so little respect or concern for the Creator and His teachings, why, how do you think God feels today? The same as back then? Well, yes, certainly so. And going on here in the Deuteronomy account, chapter 8, verse 19, he says, it must occur that if you should at all forget Jehovah your God, now he's talking to his people, you see, and you should actually walk after their gods and serve them and bow down to them, I do bear witness against you today that you people will absolutely perish. Like the nations that Jehovah is destroying from before you, that is the way you will perish, because you will not listen to the voice of Jehovah your God. Well, that certainly was fair warning. Judah knew what to expect, and Israel did. But what had the Canaanites done that was so bad that would warrant their being dispossessed from the land, exterminated by God's people? Well, in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 to 13, it talks about some of these detestable things from God's viewpoint. It says they offered their sons in sacrifice and fire. They practiced divination and magic and sorcery. And they consulted spirit mediums, going to the demons instead of to Jehovah. And they made sordid sex practices a part of their religion, using what they call high places or hills on the outside of the towns for orgies before poles or pillars that were sex symbols. They even had sacred prostitutes as a part of their religion. Well, obviously, it was very displeasing to Jehovah. In fact, Bible commentators today, such as Haley's Bible Handbook, tells about some of these terrible practices of the Canaanites and says one horrible practice that they had was called foundation sacrifices. And this is the way it went. When a house was built, a child, usually the youngest one in the family, would be sacrificed and its body built into the wall, thinking thereby to bring good luck to the rest of the family. Well, what a shocking thing to take the life of your own child that way. Hope to appease the gods and think that was pleasing to God. And then in the high places, they had these enormous quantities of images of Ashtoreth with exaggerated sex organs designed to foster sensual feelings. And the handbook says it seems that in large measure the land of Canaan had become a sort of Sodom and Gomorrah on a national scale. Archaeologists who dig in the ruins of Canaanite cities wonder what God did, that God did not destroy them sooner than he did. All right, now that was a picture as to why God drove out those Canaanites, what he was displeased as far as they are concerned. But now, why did Judah and Israel also run into God's displeasure? Well, in the case of Israel, we know they went into captivity to Assyria in the year 740 before our common era. And what had she done? Well, 2 Kings 17, verses 7 to 18 tells the story here. Little by little, it didn't happen overnight, but little by little, they fell away from the pure worship that was pleasing to Jehovah. The scripture there says they sinned against Jehovah. They went serving other gods. They began to take in a little of this interfaith religion with the Canaanites, you see. They began setting up sacred poles, the same as the nation of Canaan had before them. They began to think that their own personal pleasures and sex life were more important than the righteous rules that Jehovah had laid down. They came to serve what the Bible describes as dungy idols. From God's viewpoint, they weren't just plain ordinary idols that might have appeared beautiful to the beholder, but in God's eyes, they were dungy idols, that is, covered with manure. That's the way he viewed them. It says they hardened their necks. When the prophets would talk to them about God and their purposes, they wouldn't pay any attention. They followed vain idols. They practiced divination. And they offered their sons and daughters in fire. Well, no wonder that God let them go into captivity. But now, was this enough warning? Did Judah straighten up and do what was pleasing to God after what had happened to Israel? No, not at all. In fact, Isaiah 57, starting with verse 4, describes Judah's apostasy, and it says, "Are you not apostate children, a faithless brood, you who inflame yourself with lust under the terebinths, under every spreading tree, who slaughtered children in the valley?" And then 2 Kings 21 goes on to tell how low the nation went under King Manasseh. They set up altars to Baal. They had a sacred pole for sex worship. They even built altars in the house of Jehovah, right there in the temple. They went to profane Jehovah's sanctuary. In fact, verse 6 of that chapter says, Manasseh made his own son to pass through fire, offering his child in a fiery, flaming sacrifice. Well, we say we're shocked, though we don't think much of it when the armies of the world immolate children in sacrifice by using napalm, and it's turned against the young men of this country or another country. Well, it's very similar, isn't it, to what happened back there in the days of Judah. And then it goes on to say that instead of looking to God, they were looking for mediums and professional foretellers of events. Have you noticed an increase of that kind of thing today with books on astrology, spiritism, even witchcraft? In New York on TV, every few minutes you see something. Learn the latest in the occult and spiritism and black magic. Well, that's what Israel was doing. And the scripture goes on to say he did on a very large scale what was bad in Jehovah's eyes. So they didn't need to look any farther for a foreteller of events, one that was inspired by Jehovah, because Jehovah told them what would happen. And the account in 2 Kings 21:10 says that Manasseh was told that Jehovah would bring calamity upon Jerusalem and Judah, of which if anyone hears, both his ears will tingle. And he said, I shall simply wipe Jerusalem clean, just as one wipes the handleless bowl clean, wiping it clean and turning it upside down. So God wasn't going to let these God-defaming practices of his people continue. He was going to clean it out. And there was good reason for that prophecy, because not only had Manasseh led the people into false worship and immorality, but 2 Kings 21:16 says there was also innocent blood that Manasseh shed in very great quantity, filling Jerusalem from end to end. And according to Jewish tradition, this even includes the blood of the prophet Isaiah, whom we're concerned with. So finally Jehovah brought against him the Assyrian army, and Manasseh was taken captive to Babylon. And his acts of wickedness were so great that Jehovah determined to empty the land of Judah and Jerusalem and desolate it until such time as he would restore a remnant of his people. Well, obviously, then Jehovah didn't prepare the earth or create it to have it polluted by wicked persons either back then or at the present time. But the earth and the people on it have to reflect Jehovah's praise or be cleaned out, and those that fail to praise Jehovah are going to be removed. We know that because God's word says, I, Jehovah, am no respecter of persons. He did it to the Canaanites. He did it to his people, the Israelites. And he'll do it to the corruptors and polluters of the earth today. As the scripture says, I, Jehovah, change not. Well, now really, Christendom's position today, you see, is no better than that of ancient Judah. They claim to serve God, but where are their works? And no one disputes the rising tide of immorality or divorce, the juvenile delinquency. The children in Israel were taken out and stoned to death for the things that the youth today get away with. There's the drug addiction that's spreading over the earth. All have seen the lack of respect for God's creation as the waters and the air are polluted. The cities dump their sewage in the rivers and into the oceans. Large areas of land are stripped by mining or warfare. Literally, they're ruining the earth. And most of us have lived through wars causing the loss of life of millions of innocents, orphans wandering in hunger with no parents left because of the devastation of the war. And they've forgotten that Jehovah said, now you must not pollute the land with blood. And that's what they've done. The countries of Christendom by their international wars. Well, now, do you think it'd be appropriate for Jehovah to cleanse the earth of such conditions? It certainly seems so. It was appropriate, he felt, on prior occasions. But one thing we want to be careful of is, now, Israel and Judah had God's favor for a while. Jehovah's people today have God's favor. But are we going to stay in the position that will warrant our living through the great tribulation to inherit the earth, to take a part in the cleansing of it? Well, we have to be very careful because Jeremiah reported about the people back there. You keep polluting the land with your acts of prostitution and your badness. And how did it start? Well, probably some of those Israelites began to follow the way of the Canaanites, those who were left. Probably their dress, then their morals, then their false worship. And finally there was a complete turning away from Jehovah, and Jehovah cast them off as being unacceptable in his sight. We really have to look at things the way God looks at things. I know in one of the Society's outlines recently, it made a very nice point about dress, and it said, now, man doesn't look at things the way God looks at things. After Adam and Eve sinned, what did they do? They covered themselves with fig leaves, a kind of a skimpy, scanty little dress. Well, now, what did Jehovah think about it? You turn over the account there in the Bible, and Genesis 3:21 says, and Jehovah God proceeded to make long garments of skin for Adam and for his wife and to clothe them. So here God's standard was shown. Well, apparently the Israelites and the Canaanites, they weren't concerned with God's standard. The people of Christendom aren't generally concerned with God's standard. But now are God's people, those that bear his name, concerned with it. Well, we should be if we want his favor. It may start with a little thing. We had that drama at the convention a little while ago. Remember, the Israelites were coming out of Egypt. They were headed for the promised land. They were getting so close they could practically touch it. But here they've been on the manna that Jehovah had lovingly provided for quite some time, and now the Canaanites were trying to entice them, and they sent out their women, said, come over and have something to eat with us. Why should you bother with that manna? We have lovely things to eat. Well, that was only the first step toward immorality. To some of the Israelites, it seemed like a very simple thing, a little thing. But not so in Jehovah's sight. When they got involved in the gross immorality of the Canaanites, why, it was only by the act of one of the priests in putting two who were involved to death that the plague was stopped, and Jehovah's displeasure was turned away. Well, we don't want these kind of things to happen to Jehovah's people today. We've seen what happened before. We know what's going to happen to the world generally, and we certainly want to be kept separate from them. But now let's examine just what Isaiah did say about this matter. We're going to turn to Isaiah chapter 24 and notice a few very interesting points in the prophetic scriptures that we have recorded here. And starting with verse 1, you see he says, look, Jehovah is emptying the land and laying it waste, and he has twisted the face of it and scattered its inhabitants. And it must come to be the same for the people as for the priest. The same for the servant as for his master. The same for the maidservant as for her mistress. The same for the buyer as for the seller. The same for the lender as for the borrower. The same for the interest taker as for the one taking the interest. Without fail, the land will be emptied. And without fail, it itself will be plundered, for Jehovah himself has spoken this word. So there we have God's unchangeable word as to what he's going to do. He's going to clean up the earth. He's going to empty it of this corruption and pollution. There's going to be no respect for persons shown. Doesn't matter what position you may have today. It's going to be those who are pleasing in God's sight that will be spared. In the days of Judah, it meant emptying the land of inhabitants, just like when a dish is cleaned out. And that's the way it's going to be again. Well, now, why was the action taken? In verse 5, he says, and the very land has been polluted under its inhabitants, for they have bypassed the laws, changed the regulation, broken the indefinitely lasting covenant. That is why the curse itself will eat up the earth, and those inhabiting it are held guilty. So the scriptures show that's because of the way of life, because of turning their back on God, that these things are going to come. And Judah had broken the law given through Moses that was to run to time indefinite until the time would see the coming of the Messiah. And then Christendom today, though they claim to be under the new covenant, certainly aren't too much concerned about God's righteous principles or laws. So there's going to be a time of shaking and cleansing of the earth. And verse 6 in the latter part says, that is why the inhabitants of the earth have decreased in number, and very few mortal men have remained over. Well, now we're very glad to see that some are going to survive. And we hope by Jehovah's undeserved kindness to be among those who do. But to do so, we have to be in line and harmony with Jehovah's will now. And we note here in this scripture also a very interesting thing. What's one of the outstanding problems that the nations haven't been able to cope with today? One of the things that's affecting all of this trouble with the pollution and food shortage and all that, isn't it overpopulation? Well, because of the action God is going to take at the Great Tribulation, climaxing in Armageddon, why it says very few mortal men will be left. So right there at the start of Christ's 1,000-year rule, this problem is going to be overcome. So there'll be no overpopulation problem, certainly, in Jehovah's new system. It's true the earth will be filled as multitudes come back in the resurrection, but Jehovah certainly never intended that the earth be desolate and without inhabitant, and we notice this according to this scripture. Jehovah had given Israel the land to his people, and of course back in those days when they disobeyed him, they were taken into captivity to Babylon, and for 70 years the land was desolate. But that isn't God's purpose for the earth, because here the remnant returned, you see, to restore pure worship, to repopulate the territory, and so on. And now they came back to a land cleansed of the polluters and defilers of it. It was just like the bowl that had been turned upside down when they were taken into captivity. Now it was set right side up again, and pure worship was restored. Well, now that was a prophetic picture of how Jehovah will preserve and deliver a faithful remnant of people to survive Armageddon. And Isaiah gave us a very beautiful scriptural account of this in Isaiah chapter 45 and verses 17 to 22. I'd just like to read that. As for Israel, he will certainly be saved in union with Jehovah, with a salvation for times indefinite. You people will not be ashamed, nor will you be humiliated for the indefinite times of eternity. For this is what Jehovah has said, the creator of the heavens, he the true God, the former of the earth and the maker of it, he the one who firmly established it, who did not create it simply for nothing, who formed it even to be inhabited. I am Jehovah, and there is no one else. In a place of concealment I spoke not, in the dark place of the earth, nor said I to the seed of Jacob, seek me simply for nothing, you people. I am Jehovah, speaking what is righteous, telling what is upright. Collect yourselves and come. Bring yourselves up close together, you escapees from the nations. Those carrying the wood of their carved image have not come to any knowledge, neither are those praying to a God that cannot save. Make your report and your presentation. Yes, let them consult together in unity. Who has caused this to be heard from a long time ago? Who has reported it from that very time? Is it not I, Jehovah, besides whom there is no other God, a righteous God and a Savior, there being none excepting me? Turn to me and be saved, all you at the ends of the earth. For I am God, and there is no one else. This is the invitation, then, for life and for salvation. And we certainly want to accept this loving and kindly invitation. Because Christendom doesn't have the hope. Christendom doesn't know where to look any more than Israel or Judah did back when they were going apostate. They're rapidly getting in a bad state described here in Isaiah 24, verses 10 and 11. And this is the way Isaiah describes Israel back in those days and Christendom today. It says, the deserted town has been broken down. Every house has been shut up from entering. Reminds us of that Awake article about the 30,000 churches, wasn't it, in France that closed down because of lack of supporters? So every house has been shut up from entering. There has been an outcry in the streets for want of wine. All rejoicing has passed away. The exaltation of the land has departed. In the city, an astonishing condition has been left behind. The gate has been crushed to a mere rubble heap. Well, really, is this the condition that we begin to see creeping up even in Christendom? Of course, nothing like it would be when it falls at Jehovah's hand in the Great Tribulation. But already we notice that there's a lack of faith in God, and the religious powers of the world are beginning to crumble as a result. In fact, here's a rather interesting article. This came from Rhodesia in South Africa. And it said, for the first time, the Vatican is making a high-level effort to stem the flood of priests and nuns leaving their jobs for civilian life. The Roman Curia's Office of Education, headed by Cardinal Gabriel Garrone, summoned delegates representing bishops from all parts of the world, mothers and fathers superior and others concerned with seminaries, to see if something could be done to avert the very real prospect before the end of this century of the Roman Catholic Church being without priests. The Vatican said 14,000 priests had abandoned their vocations in the last 7 years. The average of 2,000 defectors a year is generally not considered the true picture, as it includes only those who have gone through the formalities of asking permission to be laicized. Cardinal Garrone said, "The fact is that the problem of vocations is a very real life or death question for the church." Well, Isaiah, of course, shows what the outcome is going to be, that the city is going to become like a heap of rubble, and even the gate or entranceway is going to be demolished. So desolate, just like ancient Jerusalem after Babylon's destruction of her in 607 BCE because of her unfaithfulness to Jehovah, will be the modern counterpart, Christendom. But Christendom will never be restored after the earth is wiped clean, as a remnant of the Jews were to Jerusalem. Only the faithful remnant of God's servants who have come out of her, along with the great crowd of other sheep, are going to remain to see Jehovah bless their efforts to restore the earth. Now going on in verse 13, we find that here this scripture has its fulfillment now that Jehovah has enthroned his King Christ Jesus as ruler in the heavens. And it says, "For thus it will become in the midst of the land, in among the peoples, like the beating off of the olive tree, like the gleaning when the grape gathering has come to an end. They themselves will raise their voice. They will cry out joyfully in the superiority of Jehovah. They will certainly cry out shrilly from the sea. That is why in the region of light they must glorify Jehovah. In the islands of the sea, the name of Jehovah, the God of Israel. From the extremity of the land, there are melodies that we have heard, decoration to the righteous ones." Well, certainly the gleaning of the desirable ones of the nations has been going ahead, just as back in the days of Israel when they'd knock the olives off the tree and gather in the grapes toward the end of the harvest. Well, that's the way Jehovah is gathering. Today, those that have a love for truth and righteousness. And this gleaning still continues even in Christendom, as Jehovah's servants rightfully raise a joyful voice over the ingathering. They glorify Jehovah, as Isaiah says, in the region of light, having come into an enlightened understanding of God's Word. Isaiah says the nations are in gross darkness, but Jesus said his people would be the light of the world. So no wonder they declare decoration to the righteous one as they announce and praise Jehovah's name. Well, now, what is the condition coming then, not only to Christendom, but to the whole world? Notice in verse 17 it says, "Dread and the hollow of the trap are upon you, you inhabitants of the land. And it must occur that anyone fleeing from the sound of the dreaded thing will fall into the hollow, and anyone coming up from inside the hollow will be caught in the trap. For the very floodgates on high will actually be opened, and the foundations of the land will rock." The land has absolutely burst apart. The land has absolutely been shaken up. The land has absolutely been sent staggering. The land absolutely moves unsteadily like a drunken man. It sways to and fro like a lookout hut. Its transgression has become heavy upon it, and it must fall so that it will not rise up again. Well, there's no escape from the destruction then that Jehovah brings. In fact, even the ones that have been behind the desolation of the earth and the turning of people aside from pure worship are going to go down, because verse 21 says it must occur in that day that Jehovah will turn his attention upon the army of the height in the height, and upon the kings of the ground upon the ground. Well, now, who is this army that's against Jehovah? The one in the height, the one that has this elevated position. If it isn't Satan and the demons who are anxious to fight to try to overcome Jehovah. And of course all of those upon the earth that back them in their wayward course, it's like in here the kings of the ground upon the earth. It says they'll be gathered up with a gathering as of prisoners into a pit and shut up in the dungeon, and after an abundance of days will be given attention. And then verse 23 says, "And the full moon has become abashed, the glowing sun has become ashamed, for Jehovah of armies has become king in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem." Well, now, what does it mean there in verse 23 that the full moon has been abashed and the glowing sun has become ashamed? Well, so glorious will be Jehovah and his kingdom that even the gleaming of the full moon won't compare with it in glory, or even the glowing sun at high noon. They will, so to speak, be ashamed of themselves compared with Jehovah's brightness and the radiant glory of Jehovah's kingdom. So when you consider this prophecy and see the condition of the earth today, why, we can see that there's reason to look forward to what Jehovah is going to do to clean up the earth and to change things. And certainly we agree with Isaiah 25:1, where it says, "O Jehovah, you are my God. I exalt you. I laud your name, for you have done wonderful things, counsels from early times, in faithfulness, in trustworthiness." It's really reassuring to know that Jehovah isn't fooled by the religious systems that have so misled the people. He knows what's going on in the political arenas and how they're really causing distress for mankind. And he deals with both of these areas in the next verses of chapter 25. We're going to see what Jehovah says he's going to do as far as the religious system is concerned, Christendom particularly. And in verse 2 he says, "For you have made a city a pile of stones, a fortified town, a crumbling ruin, a dwelling tower of strangers, to be no city which will not be rebuilt." Well, now, this refers to the ancient enemy of God's people, to Babylon. And in our time, to Babylon the Great, the world system of false religion. Here Jehovah says that this system is going to go down, it'll be crushed, and it won't be rebuilt. But all are going to come to know Jehovah, and so verse 3 says, "That is why those who are a strong people will glorify you. The town of the tyrannical nations, they will fear you. For you have become a stronghold to the lowly one, a stronghold to the poor and the distress he has, a refuge from the rainstorm, a shade from the heat, when the blast of the tyrannical ones is like a rainstorm against a wall. Like the heat in a waterless country, the noise of strangers you subdue, the heat with the shadow of a cloud. The melody itself of the tyrannical ones becomes suppressed." So Jehovah is going to make a change. He's going to be a refuge, a protection for his people, no matter where they may be. And Babylon the Great is going to go down. Then going down to verse 10 of this chapter, we see the action that Jehovah is going to take against the political oppressors of his people. And we've had many of them, with bans on the work in many places. We recall what happened to the brothers in Malawi, how they've been beaten and driven from their homes and even killed and so on, because there would be no part of this world by buying a political party card. Well, now what's going to happen to oppressors of God's people like that? Is Jehovah going to let them remain? Well, notice here in verse 12 or 10 it says, "For the hand of Jehovah will settle down on this mountain, and Moab must be trodden down in its place as when a straw heap is trodden down in a manure place. And he must slap out his hands in the midst of it as when a swimmer slaps him out to swim, and he must abase its haughtiness with the tricky movements of his hand. And the fortified city with your high walls of security he must lay low. He must abase it, bringing it into contact with the earth and to the dust." Well, now I know that you're all very much interested in the organization and the work of the brothers in different parts of the world. And it really is thrilling to see the progress that is being made and the desire of many right-hearted peoples yet to accept the truth. In fact, a letter came from the branch in Spain just the other day, and it said, "We're down to zero on fast-moving items due to the unprecedented increases here, plus the apparently insatiable appetite of the Spanish field for Bible literature. We received a shipment of the Truth Book in Spanish, and in just 3 months we shipped out 115,000, and the congregations are ordering as though they haven't had the Truth Books for years." Well, you can see that it keeps us pretty busy at Bethel. Of course, this progress isn't without a fight, and we appreciate that. We had the point discussed on a service meeting very recently. And we note what the scripture says there at Revelation 12, verses 15 to 17, that the dragon would war against the remnant, those that have the work of bearing witness to Jesus and who are keeping faithful to his commandments. And we see that warfare, that spiritual warfare, taking place really all over the world. In fact, recently, we took account of places where the work has been banned or is not under some kind of restriction, and there are at least 44 countries throughout the world where there are bans or governmental restrictions on the work, and only 8 of these are in communist lands. There are some places like Zambia where we have thousands of publishers, and they're forbidden to do house-to-house work. Well, it hasn't stopped the brothers. They follow up by reference, people who are interested. They concentrate on the return visit and Bible study work, and so actually the work keeps moving ahead, even though they can't do the house-to-house ministry. But these bans, this opposition against the work has come very suddenly in some places. Perhaps you remember the account out there in Singapore. The brothers went out in the field service one morning. The day dawned bright and sunny. The friends were working there at the branch office, and all of a sudden, they heard over the radio, Jehovah's Witnesses were banned. Well, now, one of the brothers had a little apartment. He was a pioneer brother. He lived above the Kingdom Hall. He had gone out in the service that morning, as was his custom. He didn't hear anything about the radio announcement. He came back that night to have a shower. There was a big padlock on the door. He couldn't even get his clothes out of the hall. Well, what's happened in Singapore? The brothers haven't been discouraged, but they've gone right ahead with the work, and they just learned to do it underground. They can't meet at the Kingdom Hall, obviously, because it's padlocked. So now they meet in the private homes of the friends. They even wanted to have a circuit assembly, so they found a beach house that was isolated. They got it at an off time during the year when there wouldn't be a lot of vacationers out there. And one group after the other would go out there and have a little picnic at the beach house, and lo and behold, they had a wonderful spiritual upbuilding circuit assembly. So they haven't been a bit discouraged. Recently, the brothers out there said that it had come to their attention from more than one sources that the reason for the ban, which is something the governments, usually won't tell you, and it's a little hard to find out, had been because a number of the clergymen of Christendom had gotten together and gone to the Prime Minister and said, now you've got to stop those people. And that's what they did. The politicians gave in to the clergy. They announced the ban. Well, now that the ban has been lifted on the work in Kenya, the brothers in Singapore say perhaps the time is right here to get the ban lifted, and they say if it's Jehovah's undeserved kindness, we're going to work to that end and make representations to the government to see if they'll reverse their decision. Now, of course, in Kenya, we've had quite a year because, a year ago they had a lovely assembly over there. Everything was going very well. A couple of months passed, and then lo and behold, the same thing happened there. The government came out with a statement. You heard it on the radio. The work was banned. Well, they had some inkling it might be coming because one of the high government officials gave a speech out at a Catholic high school a couple of weeks ahead to a group of religious people and said, now, something has to be done about people such as Jehovah's Witnesses. And sure enough, the government came along with a ban. Well, now, what was it all about? What was behind it? Well, again, of course, the government won't come out and tell the brothers, now, this is why we did it and this is what happened and so on. But there are a few things that give us a clue, because the brothers said that the charges that were made in the paper, banning the work, listed all kinds of organizations. They talk about the Russellites, the IBSA, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Standfasters, and a couple of names that nobody ever heard of. But the interesting thing is that it's the same list identically that Banda used in Malawi. Well, now, where did they get this list of names? Obviously, they got it from down there in Malawi. And now they're going to put the ban on the work in Kenya. Well, now, why do they do it? Some of the brothers over there say that what they suspect is that one of the big politicians who was so much against the work and who apparently instigated it married the daughter of some British missionaries who were friends of Banda in Malawi. And so there, we don't have the proof, but you can see the fine hand of religion getting behind to encourage these politicians to do their bidding. Well, of course, that isn't going to work out too much longer before the scriptures show the politicians will turn on the clergy and not do their bidding, but rather strip them naked, as the Bible says. But anyway, what happened? Well, again, we don't have a direct report, but it does seem that the president of Kenya objected to this banning of a religious group. The brothers are quite well known over there. They talk to the government officials. They know they're not doing anything wrong. They're trying to preach the good news. And so suddenly, lo and behold, the ban was lifted. Well, now, it may have something to do with the fact that the society filed a court action against the prosecutor general and the government to show cause for the ban against a legally recognized organization. And since the attorney general didn't have any cause he could really show, they decided they'd back out of the case. That may be, we don't know. But anyway, the ban was lifted. So right away, all of the missionaries were anxious to get back in the country to take up with the work. Well, here the government shows their authority, and thus far, not one of the missionaries has been let back in the country. We have a few brothers over there serving where the need is great as teachers and salesmen and so on. So these brothers have jumped right in. One brother, he's got a family, I think, of 4 children. He took over the operation of the branch. He tried to get the visas for the missionaries. He was turned on that, down on that. He right away got back to the government to see now if they could have the assembly that had previously been scheduled. There was nothing to stop it. We were recognized again. So he said, let's go ahead. And here he's working night and day trying to look after his family and his secular work, keep things going at the branch, keep in touch with the society, and set up a convention. And here are all these local brothers. Now, they've never really had the responsibility of running an assembly before, because always before there were Gilead-trained missionaries over there to help them with the work. Well, what would happen? We had tours going over there. Brothers had been making arrangements with the airlines and through the society to go over there to visit the brothers and attend an assembly. Well, really, we didn't know right up until the last minute. The brothers said everything looks all right, but they go around to get food for the assembly, and the businessmen would say, Jehovah's Witnesses, oh, no, we can't let you have that. Your work is banned. Well, you know, the newspaper had come out, ban on Jehovah's Witnesses revoked. Well, one of the brothers who had been over there said that most of the people don't really know all that much English. They know Swahili and a few other languages, but when they saw ban revoked, they thought it meant made stronger. So consequently, the brothers had a very hard time getting the food and setting up the assembly. Well, anyway, the government knew what it meant, and here all these travelers came in, and the brothers had to work out the assembly. They worked out the program. Brothers came from Sudan and Ethiopia and Burundi and other countries. And now what would happen? Well, the first day they had 3,000 there, and the attendance increased to 4,300. Brother Henschel was over there. He was supposed to be a tourist, and lo and behold, he winds up on the front page of the newspaper with his face there speaking to Jehovah's Witnesses convention. So if anyone had any doubt why he was there, they knew right away. And as the assembly progressed, there were 209 baptized. Everything went smoothly with these local brothers taking the responsibility. Before the assembly was over, why Brother Suter and a brother from Ethiopia and one from Sudan were privileged to go on TV. It was supposed to be a short 10 or 15-minute program, but the announcer who was interviewing got so interested, even though they cut him off for a minute, why he got him to put him back on, and the program went 28 minutes. So by the time they were done, everybody, of course, in the country with a TV set knew that Jehovah's Witnesses were alive and active, and the ban really was off. It wasn't made stronger, but it was off, and the Jehovah's Witnesses are continuing with the ministry. So it was a very encouraging time for the brothers over there. It certainly seems when we see these things that Jehovah's hand can be seen in these matters. As we recall, even King Nebuchadnezzar was compelled to say of Jehovah, according to the account in Daniel 4:35, he is doing according to his will among the army of the heavens and the inhabitants of the earth. And there exists no one that can check his hand or can say to him, what have you been doing? So it seems that it was Jehovah's will to have the assembly in Kenya, and nothing could stop it. The brothers in Israel felt very much the same way this last summer, because we only have 100 witnesses, in Israel. And I think 1,000 or so were scheduled to go over there on tours from the United States, and there were another couple of thousand from the European countries that were going to Israel. And they got over there. They were able to tour the different sites mentioned in the Bible. They enjoyed the tour. The local brothers were built up. Instead of having the local brothers give talks, generally the visitors would give talks over there to encourage the local brothers. At least it happened to some extent. And finally all the tours were done, not only from the States but also from Europe. And then what happened? Well, we all know the war broke out between Israel and Egypt, and there's been crisis over there ever since with the warring action and the peace talks and so on. And the branch office said, it was only 10 days after the last of the visitors left that the war broke out. So things were held back until that was over. Now, none of the brothers in Israel have had problems, we're very happy to say, but all are well. It does seem as though Jehovah maneuvers things according to his will and purpose. Another very interesting example of this was the hijacking that just took place down in Colombia. Maybe you've heard about it. It was on the TV and in the newspapers in New York that some of Jehovah's Witnesses missionaries going to a convention in Colombia just a week ago were hijacked. It was on TV all over the United States. Well, we were very much concerned because we had tours going through South America at the time, including the tour Brother Noah was on. We were wondering if he got hijacked too. But it didn't seem so, according to our scheduling, and they kept on saying it was a local airline flight from someplace to Cali, so that wasn't on the schedule. But as the matter developed, what happened is that some of the brothers were on a local Colombian airline, including 3 missionary couples, and they were going to the assembly down there in Colombia. Well, the brothers who were down there, when the missionaries met after the assembly, said it was something to hear the experience. because some of these missionaries are very expressive, and they were sitting there on the plane, you see, and the one sister says to her husband, "Look, that man has a gun." "Shh, I see him." And so she said again, "But he might kill us." "I know it." Well, it turned out that according to this one brother's account anyway, why he was rather polite type, if a hijacker could be polite. But he went up to the cockpit and he had this rifle that he had gone back to the lavatory to put together. It was in a little package when he came on the plane. And he got behind the navigator and stuck it behind his ear, and he says, "This is a hijacking." The guy brushed it away. He says, "Quit joking around." So he shoved the gun back against his head and said, "No, I mean it." He looked around that time. That time he got all excited, you see. Well, then they had to land and change the tire, and here all of the sisters and most of the other passengers were off except for the three brothers. And now they were going to be taken over to Cuba. Well, of course, the work really has been under ban in Cuba for quite a while. We do have the branch office there, and some kingdom halls are open, but it's just a cover for the usual suppression of the work as we find in communist lands. And many of the brothers have been in prison there, so of course the missionaries didn't know what to expect. It's an exciting time anyway. One of the brothers who was on the plane said they took off, and after about a half hour, he said he had to go to the toilet, and he wondered how the hijacker would take that, so he asked the man if he could please go back to the toilet. He said, "All right, go ahead." He was quite polite. So he went back, he came back, and he sat down. About a half hour, he decided he'd better go back again. I guess it was beginning to get to him a little bit, and he asked the hijacker, he said, "All right, go ahead." So he went back, and he sat there, and a little time passed, and it began to bother him again. He asked the hijacker, he said, "No, you've been back too much already." Well, he said he sat there for about an hour and 57 minutes. I guess he took an accurate count, and he says then he was ready to go whether the hijacker shot him or not. But by that time, the man let him go. So, anyway, they landed in Cuba, and the hijacker got off. That was the last they saw of him. But then the Cuban officials came on a plane and took him into a room, and now they were going to question certain ones. And they happened to decide they questioned this missionary. And they asked who he was and where he was going, and so he decided, well, he didn't know what was going to happen, so he might as well let his last moments be praising Jehovah. So he said, "Well, I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and our group is going to an assembly of Jehovah's Witnesses in Colombia." Well, that took the man back a little bit, you see, because Jehovah's Witnesses are supposedly CIA agents, according to Cuban propaganda. So the man got in a little conversation. He said something about Jehovah's Witnesses. You should be more intelligent to believe that kind of thing in God and so on. And the missionary decided, well, he might as well talk to this man while he had the chance. And he said, "No," he said, "you're the one that ought to be more intelligent. There's no question about the existence of God. Anyone that closes his eyes to that is being very foolish." He said, "Now, obviously, you're a man that doesn't have any faith." But he said, "What you need is for one of Jehovah's Witnesses to have a Bible study with you so you'd learn something." Well, the man got a little flustered at that and jumped up and walked down the hall out of the room. So the brother hopped up and followed him right down the hall. Well, when they got to a big crowd there, the man stopped for a minute, and the brother came up to him and said, "No, I mean it. You really should have a Bible study with Jehovah's Witnesses." Well, that was too much. Now all the others were hearing it, and that time the man disappeared. But they got all of the brothers back together, and they gave them a tour through town, and they tried to tell them that all of these buildings that had been there for a long time were put up by the communists, and weren't they making fine progress. And the brother said, "Well, it's, like many other cities, they didn't go on to say it wasn't as clean as where they come from as they were thinking, but they did want to get back to the assembly." And sure enough, after being hijacked and on the way and coming back, they did get back to the assembly 3 days later, and none the worse for wear, and very happy to be reunited and to be able to freely enjoy the spiritual feast in Colombia that the many brothers in Cuba are not able to enjoy at the present time because of the situation there. Now, just to tell you a few items from other places, in Nigeria, the brothers had some tremendous assemblies. They had over 65,000 in Lagos, 107,000 in Port Harcourt, that's over in the eastern part where they were warring a couple of years ago, 41,000 in Benin City, a total of 214,000 attendants in Nigeria, as compared to about 90,000 publishers. And they had over 7,100 baptized, so there's been a tremendous increase over there. The brothers in Port Harcourt had a rather interesting experience. They were making arrangements to house the many thousands of brothers coming to the assembly. So they asked permission of the Ministry of Education to use school buildings in the area, and permission was granted to use 24 schools that way. Well, now, the thing about this is that most of these schools had previously been owned and operated by various religions. And the government had taken over all of these previous religious schools just about a year earlier. Well, of course, quite a few of the schools had been built alongside the church or the religious mission, as you can imagine. And this was a real source of annoyance to the religious leaders to have the government take over their buildings. Well, now, imagine at this assembly, here's the one big school, right next door to the Catholic St. Mary's Church, and it's a great big 3-story primary school building, so it holds a lot of brothers, and a lot were assigned out there, and here the assembly starts, and all of these brothers start flooding out to this primary school. Well, of course, the word got around, Jehovah's Witnesses are going to be staying in the school while they're going to the assembly. Well, that shook up the priest in the church right next door. He was a European priest. He came over to find out what was going on, and of course, not too long ago, he could tell everybody just what to do. He rushed down now to see what was going on. Well, the assistant rooming overseer was there at the time, and he said, well, these are all Jehovah's Witnesses here, and the government has kindly permitted us to accommodate them in this school. Well, he said that the priest was really dumbfounded. He didn't know what to say, and after all, what could he say? Because it wasn't his school anymore, and he just left in frustration. Well, the brothers were very happy to have the accommodations and to appreciate what a further witness is really being given, because the different churches took sides in this warfare. And the government doesn't view the religions very kindly over there, with the exception of Jehovah's Witnesses, because they didn't take sides or fight on either side in the Biafran War. Tribalism is a big problem over there, as religion has been. And so at one of the assemblies, a bishop, an African self-styled bishop, attended the public talk and the concluding comments, and he saw all of these brothers from different tribes, and you can tell them by the way they dress or the facial markings and so on. And he asked one of the brothers in amazement, when he saw this peace and unity, he says, how can you keep them from fighting? Because, you see, their religions haven't been able to do it. But here, when they come into Jehovah's organization, or they put on a new personality, and they become a peaceful people. Well, it's wonderful to get the experiences from brothers in different places. Another one related at one of the assemblies shows that more and more people know where to look for Bible information. At one of the assemblies, the brothers heard about a person that had many problems, and he was telling all his problems, his woes to his neighbor. And you know what the neighbor said? Why don't you pray to God about it, and then one of Jehovah's Witnesses will come and he can explain the Bible to you. One of the outstanding assemblies in many ways was the one held in El Salvador in Central America. They have 3,600 witnesses there at the present time, including many serving there from the States. But with 3,600, they had a peak attendance of 10,788, almost 3 times as many. And there were 1,046 baptized, or about 1/3 of all the witnesses were baptized at the assembly. So the brothers, of course, were very thrilled about this. But as we mentioned, Satan is busy in many places trying to stir up trouble and to cause enmity and hatred toward the brothers and cause problems if he can. One of those places is in South Africa. Brother Suter and Brother Henschel were anxious to go down there to see the society's property and visit the branch and encourage the brothers. When they applied up here at the consulate in New York City, they were told, well, they'd have to refer it to South Africa. After a while, they checked back, and the answer was, no, you can't enter. So they had the South African branch checked, and the South African branch talked to the officials down there, and they said, no, absolutely not. We're not going to let Jehovah's Witnesses in. So the brothers in Washington talked to the State Department, and the State Department said, well, when you have property down there, I don't see why you can't visit. South Africa's been doing more of this kind of thing. We're going to protest. But nothing happened. So now, was Jehovah's hand shortened? Well, this is the story. The brothers went ahead with their assembly plans, and down there, because of the apartheid arrangement of segregation of the races, the Indians are separate, the blacks are separate, the Europeans are separate. They can't meet together freely and openly. Why, the brothers thought that they'd have to have 3 assemblies. They weren't even sure that they could get permission for some of the assemblies. But lo and behold, everything worked out little by little, and they wanted to have all of the brothers from the different races together on the concluding day. And the government said, no, absolutely not. It's not possible. We won't permit it. Then at the last minute, they heard that there was this one part of territory there in Cape Town that isn't zoned, shall we say, for any one of the races, and they've got this big stadium there, and apparently the government did it on purpose. And they say as long as you don't have any meals or any eating there, anybody from any race can go there for an event. Well, that was just what the brothers wanted. So they had their morning program Sunday morning at the various local sites, and then they all streamed from all over the city that afternoon into the big Rand Stadium. And here, what a thrilling sight for those brothers to see all the friends from the different tribes and races and so on assembled together for one big assembly. And it really was work to Jehovah's praise and honor, because now the news took notice of it and publicized this. And even though Brother Suter and Brother Henschel couldn't get in there, why, here we had tours going in from Sweden and from Germany. The branch overseer from Germany got down there with his tour. The officials got a little excited when they found out that these were Jehovah's Witnesses, but it was too late. The arrangements were pretty well made. So another Brother Kelsey from Germany, served as the zone overseer, and everything went off smoothly, just as though Jehovah were directing everything the way he wanted it. In fact, along the same line, the brothers in Colombia, because of the strong religious influence in the government there, have kind of avoided any publicity down there. Well, you can imagine what happened when these brothers there got hijacked. Why, everything got in the TV and the radio and the news, and it was on the front page, Jehovah's Witnesses, their assembly, the hijacking. They said they were trying to keep out of the limelight because they didn't want any problems. It looks like Jehovah wanted them in the limelight so that people would know what was going on and that Jehovah's people were active in Colombia. So that's the way it worked out. Well, as Jesus foretold, you'd be objects of hatred by all the nations. And that certainly seems to be true, but we're not concerned about what the nations think, but rather about what Jehovah thinks. Now, I know many brothers have been very much concerned about the friends who fled from Malawi and had to put up such a fine fight for the truth, leaving their lands and homes and jobs and so on, and become refugees and now settled in Mozambique. But really, Jehovah has blessed them. The Portuguese have been very kind. Even though the work is banned officially in Mozambique, they made refugee camps. They allotted land for them to set out their gardens and to work in. They permitted them to freely hold their meetings. So for the first time in 10 years, those Malawi brothers could meet together and sing the kingdom songs now in a land where the local brothers can't even do it, and have their meetings and have their circuit assemblies and all that. But they've had problems. You know, the Malawi government wants to know what's going on, and according to one report we got, why, they infiltrated some brothers into this camp of Jehovah's Witnesses in Mozambique. A brother from Malawi came up from South Africa. He's a businessman. He had some big business holdings and some bank accounts in Malawi, and he said, well, these brothers need some clothes and some food over there, and I'd like to help. So he went to the camp first, and he talked to the brothers. He says, I've got money in the bank back in Malawi, and he says, I don't think I'll be bothered. I want to go back there, withdraw the money, and bring it over here. Well, one of the men there, a prominent position in the camp, stepped forward and said, the thing for you to do is to go to this certain bank on Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock, because that'll be the best time and nobody will bother you. So he said, all right, thanks. Well, 2 days later, he was still in the camp, and his son, who was not in the truth, who still lives in Malawi, came over to the camp and said, is my father here? They said, yes. He said, I understand you're going to this certain bank in Malawi. He said, that's right. He said, don't go, they're waiting for you. So that's how they came to find out that there was someone in the camp that was really serving as a spy for the Malawi government. Well, the brother went in anyway, but he went to a different bank and was very happy to get out with the funds that the brothers needed. Now, the brothers have had problems in Rhodesia and South Africa in sending in supplies. Some of the brothers would like to have some more clothing. The big camp at Malangeni, where there's 15,000, may have to move because there just isn't enough land around there to support them all, and the Portuguese aren't going to do it indefinitely, and we know it. So it appears that some will have to get relocated, which means they'll have to build new homes and thatch the roofs. It all costs money, you see, and get some seed for the ground and so on. Well, we've been doing what we can, but the Portuguese say, no, we don't need any outside help. We can handle our own problems. So it's very difficult. Many brothers here have said, can we send clothing? Can we send money? Can we send food? Well, no, you can't, because they won't let it in. So the brothers are trying to work through the back door, you might say, through Rhodesia and South Africa, and generally the brothers have been pretty well cared for. And we're continuing to do everything we can through those neighboring branches, which seems to be the best way to handle it and the needs of the brothers. And we're very thankful to Jehovah that he's opened the minds of the Portuguese authorities over there to provide for the brothers as well as they have. Whether things will really change, of course, we don't know. But there's a brother who worked in a leprosarium in Malawi, and recently he got notification from the Malawi government that they'd like to have him return. And they said, you won't be harmed, you won't be bothered, we just want you to come back to take up your work. And here's 3 months' salary. Well, the brother looked at that, and then he said, send it back. He said, I'm not going to accept unearned money. And he said, I don't want to come back when my brothers can't have freedom of worship in the country where I am. So whether that indicates a change, of course, remains to be seen. But in the meantime, the brothers in Malawi do have a certain amount of freedom, and they're making out quite well, and the brothers in neighboring countries are doing everything they can to assist them. And certainly they're very happy about the freedom of worship that they're enjoying in these camps. Well, now we might mention how the work is going in some other countries. It's really phenomenal. You know, you hear about peaks in the work, but in Indonesia, the brothers had a peak of 3,297 publishers in December, and this was the seventh consecutive increase, seventh peak in 7 months for Indonesia. Japan, a non-Christian land, but a country where the people are very much interested in education and reading, we find many, many accepting the truth, and they had 20,453 publishers in December, which was 25% more than the same month a year ago. Imagine that. 1 out of every 4 new in the last year in Japan. And that was their 77th consecutive peak. So they just start slowing up a bit in Japan. Then in Thailand, with a lot of Buddhism there, they had 493 publishers. They're very happy about that peak in December, and that was their 3rd in a row, a 13% increase over last December. In Ivory Coast in Africa, they have 704 in the field. That was their 4th peak this year, 16% above last December. Even in Lebanon, where the work is under ban, they had their 3rd consecutive peak of publishers with 1,562. Korea still is just nosing ahead of Japan in publishers, and they had 21,126, and that was 20% over last year's average. But now, when we see the growth of the work in other lands, we say, well, how are we doing here? It's really amazing. We reached a new all-time peak in publishers for December of 525,007 publishers. Now, in December 1972, we had 421,000 publishers, which means this December we have 103,000 more publishers than a year ago. An increase of 24% from December 72 to December 73. Isn't that amazing?